Good afternoon. Wow. Thank you. Lots of you out here today. Thank you for coming. We see you all. The room has a strange configuration, but I see the corner. Nobody can sleep. I know it's nap time, but no. We have a lot of news and recommendations for you today. And so let's first start very quickly with brief introductions. And I'll let the smarter one start. So Johan is going to introduce himself, and he's at the end of the session to make sure you stay. So he's going to talk now.
All right, I'm Johan. I'll be the host of the last part of the session. I'm basically the trained demo monkey for this session. But I spend my days traveling this blue planet of ours, helping customers implement software updates through WSaaS, through Config Manager, through imaging processes. So I will take you through the technical configurations of that side when it's time to for my part of the demo.
Right. Thank you, Johan. So my name is Thierry Paquet, and I work in Michael Beck's organization. For those of you who made the prior session on Windows as a Service and what it means for your business, I'm part of the team that ships Windows updates every month and sometimes more frequently than every month for Windows Client and Windows Server. And over the last 2 years or so, we have evolved how we release Windows updates. Some of you have noticed, some of you have given us feedback about that, and some of you may not have noticed yet. And so we want to catch you up with those things and give you some recommendations on how to best apply the new way of doing Windows updates. But to be very clear about the scope of this session, this is not Windows 10, and therefore this is not Windows Update for Business. There's been other sessions that cover that. We won't cover that here today because we're talking today, or in this session anyway, about managing Windows updates on pre-Windows 10 OSs, which, of course, for all of you, that's what you're managing today because Windows 10 is not released yet. So the first topic I'd like to bring up, if my clicker agrees, yes, is that we'd like to improve and increase the dialogue with IT pros. And so we've had an IT Pro blog for a while, and would like to start a series to talk about Windows updates on this blog. The first post will be in a week or so. We didn't want to conflict and confuse people between the Windows Update for Business blog that Terry Myerson posted yesterday and this blog that will talk about pre-Windows 10 managing Windows updates. And of course, when Windows 10 releases, it will be one and the same. But temporarily, it's not. And so in a week or so, there will be a first post to this blog. I'd love for you guys to go take a look. The first post will essentially introduce the topic of Windows updates and how to manage them in an IT enterprise large environment. But it will also ask you what is top of mind for you. And so we want this to be a dialogue where you tell us what are top priority topics for you. We've heard questions about roll-ups. Somebody asked questions about roll-ups in Mike's session earlier. We'll cover some of that today. But clearly, there's more depth to go into and more questions that you might have.
And speaking of dialogue, you might notice there are actually 2 laptops on stage in addition to the normal desktops. But on this one over here, I'm actually monitoring the Twitter feed, so that's my secondary job in this session. And also the Jammer part of Ignite. So if you do have comments, questions whatsoever, feel free to post them as well, and we'll try to address them when there is time for Q&A.
Yeah, sounds great. And speaking of Q&A, we will leave 15 to 20 minutes at the end of this session for questions, and we'll be here, and Mike and others are here to help answer those as well. So we would like for this to be very interactive, and the session is mostly about laying a foundation of what we believe are recommendations and best practices, and then you'll tell us if it works, or if you have better practices, or if they raise questions for you.
They work.
Thank you. Okay, so there's been a lot of discussions and press remarks about Windows updates. And what I'd like to do for today is to kind of separate those into 3 categories so that we have clear view into security updates, hot fixes, and update roll-ups, because they each behave differently and have different consequences and implications from a management perspective. So I will go fast over security updates. Terry talked about this yesterday. Brad Anderson talked about it. There's been a lot of talk about security. There's probably no need to reiterate, and we all know this very well, that security is top of mind. It's a big concern, and maintaining systems as secure as possible, as quickly as possible, is a really important thing to do. And that will continue to be the case. That doesn't change. Sony is one example I have here, but again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time there. What I will say, though, is there's another tension there. If you've been to some other slide, other discussions, there were tension slides shown, and Mike had one of those. And the tension here for you, primarily, that's the feedback we receive now, most of the time, is the risk of quality related to deploying security updates, particularly because there's not a lot of time. Security updates can be very quickly reverse engineered by people who would like to exploit those security flaws. And therefore, you have to deploy them quickly, and therefore, if there's a quality problem, it ends up manifesting itself in your environment. So that doesn't change, and that is a tension. We will continue to do our very best, of course, to deliver quality security updates. It's not perfect, we're not perfect, and sometimes the time frames given to us by finders and exploits don't allow perfection, but we'll continue to improve. I did want to give you a statistic that is interesting to help you hopefully relieve some of that tension. Again, if my clicker works, there we go. Is that, as all stats, it needs a little bit of explanation, but in 2014, 87% of Windows and Internet Explorer security updates were successful. By successful, this is a very, very high bar. You may say 87% is not high enough for me. Fair. The bar here is that they didn't have to be re-released, i.e. nobody reported, there was not a peep, nobody had a problem with any of them, 87% of those. The remaining 13%, somebody had some problem with it. It doesn't mean they failed miserably for everybody. It means there was something that caused us to re-release them. In general, this is a pretty good number, and you should feel good about that, and you should continue to deploy security updates as quickly as possible. I realize that some of you do have some validation to go through. Do what you need to do. But don't let the HTTP.sys security denial of service exploit hit you like it did some customers 2 weeks ago because the update was reverse engineered very quickly. Don't let that happen to you. Deploy as quickly as possible. Keep validating as needed, but deploy as much as possible. And I will now add that, as Terry Myerson mentioned yesterday, the primary value of Windows 10, Windows Update for Business, etc., is keeping systems up to date all the time. And you do that for security updates, but not necessarily for the other update types that I'm about to mention. And that in itself causes a quality risk. As a matter of fact, in Mike's session, I had a gentleman come up to me and say that they've had some problems in their environment because they were missing non-security updates in their environment. They weren't up to date. They only updated security. And there's other updates that sometimes have dependencies or in a particular environment are needed to run well. So this takes us to the second category of Windows updates, which are hotfixes. And so hotfixes, you know what they are. You are IT pros. You're the ones that call us when you find a bug, and we fix the bug for you, and we give you a hotfix that solves that particular bug. Hotfixes, historically, this is based on the Windows XP generation and has carried over until very recently. You tend to deploy when needed. If you have that problem, you deploy that hotfix. If you called us with that problem, you'll deploy it. If you didn't, you may search for it, and if you experience the same symptoms, you'll deploy it. As a matter of fact, we even have still today, we're working on this, but we still have text today that goes with some hotfixes that says, only deploy this hotfix if you are experiencing the exact symptoms described in this KB article, for example. And so there's a whole set of habits around this that say, I only deploy the hotfix if I had the problem. What's bad about that is When the problem is data corruption in a database or in a file system on a file server, or when the problem is a blue screen, a bug check, or the problem is a system hang and it happens on a server that is clustered, it's really bad to wait for that problem to happen. Then your business suffers. And so our recommendation is deploy hotfixes proactively. Not all hotfixes necessarily, but search for information about hotfixes around data corruption, around bug checks, system hangs, server problems, performance problems, and deploy them proactively. In the last 2+ years, they are tested exactly the same way. As a matter of fact, they are what we test. They are a superset of the non-security fixes. So, as I said, we are cleaning up all the text that tells you to not deploy them, and we'll get to that, but you can deploy them. And do testing if you need to, but just don't wait for that data corruption problem to happen to you. So those were the two easy topics. Now let's get into a little bit more complex, and this is where Johan is then going to show you how to implement some of those best practices into WSUS and Config Manager, because there's some thought process that needs to go around handling other Windows updates. So other Windows updates I categorize as roll-ups. It's not entirely roll-ups, but it really makes its way into roll-ups, and that's why I call them that. So a Windows update follows a journey. Obviously, at first, it's engineered at Microsoft and tested. And we do a lot of app compat and device compat testing, etc. Once it switches across the wall and it's no longer within Microsoft, it makes its way, it gets published to Windows Update and through that channel to WSUS as well. Now, and for the last 2 years or so, since Windows 8, we release Windows Update that are not security updates as optional updates. As a matter of fact, about 2 weeks ago, somebody reported, oh my God, Microsoft is releasing 34 optional updates. What should we do about this? We've been doing this for 2 years. And what you should do, well, if you are a consumer, 96% of devices that consumers use are accepting the defaults of automatic updates and never see those updates. Automatic updates does not install optional updates. The 4% that remain of consumers, I'm going to get to IT pros in a second, the 4 remaining % of consumers are experts of some kind. They're hackers, they're gamers, they're power users, they're maybe IT pros that want to understand what updates are out there, etc. And those who manage updates manually, who don't accept the defaults and go connect and click on things, do tend to install optional updates. And our telemetry tells us we get millions of those installations every month. And so publishing updates as optional for a certain amount of time gives us the ability to collect telemetry and see if those updates work or don't work, and correct any flaws if needed, before marking them recommended or important for the whole world to take. And we've been doing that, as I said, for a couple of years now on Windows 8 and Windows 8.1 and Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2. And so if everything goes well, after a certain amount of time, sometimes 30 days, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, we then promote those updates to recommended single updates. It's just one update for one bug problem being resolved, or roll-ups. And there were questions earlier about monthly roll-ups. We did monthly roll-ups until last December, and then no more monthly roll-ups. I'll talk about roll-ups in more specific terms in a second, but then I just want to mention quickly on this slide that once these single updates or update roll-ups have been in market for a while, we then have started building them into convenience roll-ups. Now, this is not a technical term. This is actually a term meant primarily for you guys in IT, because it's primarily a convenience feature for you. I'll talk about those in more details, but those are cumulative, meaning that it's one update to get all the way up to speed from the last time that we baseline the operating system. So let's go into the more specifics. Optional updates. I just mentioned that for consumers, we get millions of devices because power users, etc., click and install optional updates. We get telemetry back from them. What we don't get is telemetry back from you, IT pros, because you're IT pros and you don't deploy optional updates. And we haven't explained to you that we would like for you to test optional updates, which we're doing today, and the blog will help us continue that dialogue. And if you act as a power user and you are doing this on your own machine, we have no way of differentiating you from the rest of the power users, so we're not really getting enterprise feedback. We don't know the difference between your experience and that of a gamer, for example. And so what we'd like to ask you today, and again, Johan will demo this in the tools later on, is to test those optional updates that come out every month. They can be roll-up, they can be individual, they work just like any other update, they pass through the tools the same way, etc. The only subtlety is that in WSUS, and therefore in Config Manager, it requires that you check the update classification in addition to the critical update classification. Because once they're optional on Woo, they show in WSUS in the update classification. That's an additional step. That's one of the best practices we're recommending today. And again, Johan will demo this later on. But conceptually, you know, and actually the screenshot I have here is from the UI. You can do this yourself on your own device today if you'd like. Is go look in Woo, scan Windows Update, and you'll see a list of optional updates that are, if everything goes well, going to be promoted to recommended next month. So help us validate those optional Windows Updates while they're optional. We need enterprise feedback, and today we don't know what's happening in the IT Pro world with those updates, and we need to know. It would be great also if you turned on telemetry. I know that's a bit more of a big ask, I realize that, but essentially, we want feedback to know if those are enterprise-ready, enterprise quality before we put them recommended in the future. I'm sorry, I'll have to take questions at the end, but please, get ready. All right, so please, let's go. Okay, so here's the same screenshot. I know you can't read it. Don't worry about it. The point is that you can look at it on your device today. You'll see something very similar. This is my device 2 days ago, my Surface, so you'll see something very similar to this, which in my case, there are two important and one recommended updates, Windows updates, KB something, something, something. And what I'm telling you guys is that when you see this in the UI, it means those have been vetted by several million consumers through the optional cycle process, and they are now ready to deploy. Okay. We would like for you to deploy these proactively. Validate them while they're optional. Once they go recommended, once they show up in the critical update category in WSUS and SCCM, deploy them proactively. I know that's a big ask. I know today a lot of you only deploy security updates. In order to look and simplify your IT process and policies and make it look very much like what Windows 10 will look like once it releases and it's in your environment, having your devices be always up to date is the best policy. It's the easiest for troubleshooting. It's the easiest for, if you need to call us for support, typically we'll ask you to install the latest version of something or other if you don't have it installed already. And it's been pretty stable for the last couple of years. As a matter of fact, we now have a few million Windows Server 2012 R2 instances hooked up to Windows Update. They are always up to date. They are on automatic update. Several million 2012 R2 server instances. Very likely they're in VMs, they might be running in a host somewhere, and somebody decided, I am not going to micromanage updates on these servers. They serve some other purpose, and managing updates is not something I want to worry about. Millions of Windows Server 2012 R2 are connected to Woo and taking automatic updates. They are up to date. All of your BYOD devices are up to date. So in your environment, if you have a set of devices that you manage by only deploying security updates and another set that are BYOD that come in, they're not configured the same way. They're running different code. The BYOD guys are always up to date. They have the latest code. The others don't. And so our recommendation is let's all together get up to date. Give us feedback. We'll fix bugs. This is what our team is here to do, and we'll resolve those problems. Particularly in the context of Woo for Business, for your business users, information workers, etc. It may take you a little while to convince your server team to agree to this. Fair. But there is certainly some steps we can take to move forward and get closer to this. Although I will talk about server in a second. Okay, then let's get to specifically update roll-ups then. So we would like for you to deploy those proactively as well. But how are they different? What's different about a roll-up? So a Windows Update roll-up is a single package, single download, single installation, single reboot, which is a big deal for you guys. You give us feedback all the time that reboots are a problem. So a roll-up is a way to reboot one time and get more than one bug fix or new piece of code installed. And so let's talk about a few, again, having clicker problem, a few specific roll-ups. And I'll start with the first one that was actually pretty popular. We've had several 100,000 downloads of this one from the hotfix server. The hotfix server is only available to enterprise customers that purchase Premier contracts. And so it's a limited audience and a limited number of admins, and there's one download per customer typically. And the fact that we've had plenty of downloads says it's popular. A lot of people have wanted this. We've also got feedback about this. This is a Windows 7 Server 2008 R2. Applies to both, same code. Networking update rollup. It was also called, for those who remember, slow boot, slow logon. Anybody remember this one? Yep, I see a lot of you. Awesome. So this was a collection of hotfixes we put in a single update, and it was the first version of a convenience rollup that we'll talk about in a minute more. Deploy these proactively. These are good. These are good for you. It's a collection of hotfixes. You don't need to go through every single problem. It's a little similar to the data corruption problem I mentioned earlier. Don't wait to have the problem. Deploy these. A lot of other people have deployed it. It hasn't had regressions. There's really no reason not to deploy those things. It also gets you in this habit of deploying things proactively and keeping your systems up to date. We are right now planning to have a convenience rollup that is more encompassing for Windows 7 and Windows 2008 R2 post SP1 to help you essentially get up to speed on one shot. I don't have a date for that yet, but we're working on that so that you'd have a way to not just slow boot, slow log on problems resolved, but simply get up to date on those OSs as a way to get a clean baseline to upgrade from as you move to Windows 10. As you move to Windows 10, of course. Okay. In April 2014, we released another update rollup. That one caused a little bit of stir. Some of you were not too happy with us. But given the small reaction, I guess some of you have forgiven us by now, or maybe it didn't hit you as much. So in April 2014, we did a big update rollup. It had a few features, primarily mouse and keyboard support for modern applications to kind of get some polish on Windows 8.1 so it would work well in enterprises. It was to convince you and your end users that Windows 8.1 was usable and that modern apps could be used with mouse and keyboard. There was also a huge feature with Internet Explorer Enterprise mode, which helped you standardize on IE 11 and IE 8 compatibility mode in 11 and all of the compat modes below that. And that was a big blocker for you guys, and there was feedback we had received, and so we released it as part of this update. It also fixed a bunch of bugs, I'm sorry, and caused a few regressions, as you can see. It was a big chunk of code, and so there were some regressions there. They're all resolved now. The reason it caused a stir was less because of what it was, and more because we asked you to deploy it in 30 days, or you would not have security updates without it, or on any machine that didn't have it installed. And you gave us feedback, and we heard you, and we extended that time frame to 4 months, and we all worked through it. And it was kind of painful that we learned from that, and you'll see in a second that we then did other things so that you wouldn't have that requirement. So nevertheless, though, we are there. And one thing that's important to note is that this was also for Windows Server, and this has worked for Windows Server 2012 R2 as well. Also, initially, a little painful, but now we'll work through it. Oh, one more thing. Oh, good, my clicker didn't work, but I didn't want it to work this time. We also released new ISO images. I don't know if all of you realize that, but that was a way to make things easier for you also, because it was a new baseline, and it was a lot easier if you had VMs or if you had new devices coming in. You could just start from scratch with a fully up-to-date image without having to inject 1,000 bug fixes, single updates, and hot fixes and other things. You could simply use that image to start from. In August, we released another update roll-up, a little bit smaller. We didn't make a big deal. We didn't call it the Windows 8.1 Update 2 or something. It had no name. So in that sense, it looked very much like a monthly update roll-up. It did have a few features in it. Not super disruptive features, but if you care, important features. So the MP4 video capture feature was very important to some enterprise customers that were into high-end video editing, for example. So there was some important good value delivered there. 24 bug fixes, 2 resolve regression, and my slide has a mistake. We didn't do ISO images in August, but that's okay. In November, then, we released another update roll-up. Now, by the way, we also released monthly roll-ups in between, October and September, etc. In November, we released another significant update roll-up that included significant new features, including defense in depth for Internet Explorer, new technology that is user mode only around Internet Explorer in Windows 8.1, 2012 R2 in November. It's in the entire OS in Windows 10, and it hardens the operating system and would have mitigated hundreds of IE vulnerabilities prior to that release. We actually did the analysis of how many vulnerabilities did we have to do security update for IE prior to that release, and hundreds of them would not have been vulnerabilities or would have been strongly mitigated by this feature that strengthens the browser. And then we have a few management features, desired state configurations, software inventory logging, and things like that. This update also fixed 66 bugs, had 2 regressions that have now been resolved. And this update is the baseline for our cloud platform system. So for those of you who have not heard of Cloud Platform System, CPS, it's essentially a cloud in a box. You buy your private cloud, and it's a whole bunch of servers pre-configured with Windows Server, SCCM, and additional orchestration on top, clustered hosts, clustered VMs, high-end, mission-critical, super robust environment. It runs this update. I think you can run it too. So my ask is deploy this. Internally, we call this the Windows 8.1/Server 2012 R2 LTSB. LTSB is a new concept Mike talked about, which is primarily a Windows 10 concept. But in our mind, this is the stable, strong, polished, mission-critical, ready for prime time, ready for really, really critical workload, final update, after which security updates and only critical bug fixes come on that platform. So deploy it. We also provided ISO images for that update to make it easy for you to baseline with it. So in summary, if we think of the update journey, I'm asking you to do three things. When the update is optional, validate it, give us feedback. Talk to us about, is it working for enterprise environments? Is it working with your systems, your configurations? When these updates go recommended, whether they're standalone or roll-ups, we'll keep doing both depending on the needs and the feedback and the volume of things, etc. Deploy them proactively. Why can you deploy them proactively? Because you validated them while they were optional, so they can now be deployed. And then when we do convenience roll-ups, use those to rebaseline or to create new baselines. But the good news about those is they come the same way. You can also just deploy them. So baselining no longer means wipe, load, image. You can baseline simply by deploying. And this is another concept that will come through with Windows 10 much more strongly and more automated, etc. And if you do these things, you will be, in many ways, managing your devices and servers in the same way as you will when Windows 10 comes in your environment. It'll look very much the same. So from a process, practice, policy perspective, they won't be very different. While today, if you only deploy security updates and keep all the others aside, that's going to be very different with Windows 10. And the end systems that you're running will look very differently because some will be always up to date and some will not. And now you'll have the additional complexity of different OSs. Okay? So I know I've dropped a lot of theory and complexity, hopefully not too much. Again, I'm asking for three things. Okay, 5. Deploy security updates as soon as possible. Deploy hotfixes that can cause you big problems proactively. And then 3 for Windows updates that are not those 2. Validate them monthly when they're optional. Deploy them proactively. And use them as a baseline when we do convenience, big roll-ups that are cumulative. Okay? So with this, please write down your questions. I know there's questions in your mind now, but we're going to shift gears and go into 300 level details with Johan, maybe 400 or 450 even. And so I'll let him do his show, but I will be happy to answer questions after on this part, and I will come back for that.
All right, thank you, Terry. So if I can steal my screen over here. Ta-da. I have 3 parts to the demo. First, configuration of standalone WSUS for software updates, the way Terry described it. Then the same part, but with Config Manager and the software update point integration. And finally, the story around imaging, preparing reference images, and also at deployment time, making sure that that process is also covering these scenarios that has been discussed in this session. So starting off with standalone WSUS. There are requirements to it, of course. You need a report viewer to get the reports, and you need some kind of database to it. And for most customers running WSUS in Europe, I'm from Europe, they are mainly, 5,000, 6,000 people at the most, while over here, that can be like 25,000 seat running WSUS. But for these smaller customers, I typically recommend, smaller but medium-sized then, customers, I typically recommend to use the SQL Express edition. Why? Well, first of all, it's constantly being updated, so I can take advantage of new performance updates that are available to SQL Express. There are management tools included in the download, so that I can manage it quite efficiently to do some configurations. But why would you not use SQL Express? Why would you rather use the default Windows internal database for WSUS? it doesn't have any limitations in memory and in database size, which SQL Express have. But in general, if you're a 1,000-seat customer, you're running SQL Express, and if your WSUS database grows beyond 10 gigabytes, you have other problems. So you normally not run into any issues with that. But if you go higher, you may want to use the internal database instead because it doesn't have those limitations. Actually, there are limitations. It can only use 524 gigs of RAM, so make sure to scale up your WSUS server there. But for most environments, I use SQL Express for this. But of course, I need to do some configurations to SQL Express as well. So first of all, when you add the roles, you can either do it through Server Manager as you're used to. Adding roles is collecting inventory data. Yeah, give it a second. So I'm adding roles, and as you can see, I have already added in Windows Update, but I did not include the Windows Internal Database. Instead, I installed SQL Express prior to this and used that as part of my setup. So these are your two options there. You can also do this in PowerShell, of course. So if I open up a PowerShell prompt, go to my demo folder, WSUS, and open the install script, I can very easily do the same operation there, but I can also, of course, script in the post configuration that I want to do for WSUS. You know, that pop-up wizard that normally comes in when you do it through the management UI. So the benefit of doing it through a script is that you also documented the procedure, and, well, testing in lab, you can easily run it over and over again, which is nice. But what are the other configurations I recommend that you do? Well, first of all, SQL Event Express version, even though it's limited to how much memory? 1 gigabyte. But it's only one of the buffers, and SQL have many. The database size is 10 gig, SQL memory is 1 gig, but it's only one of the buffers. So you can easily see in a SQL Express installation consuming 8, 9 gigs of memory. So how do we fix that? You cap the memory. You go to Properties, you go to Memory, and you set some kind of limitations on the memory that fits your server, the amount of memory that you have in the server. So that's one thing. Another thing is that WSUS is using IIS in the back end for everything. And it has an app pool as well. And what I've found in some larger environments is that that app pool sometimes may need to be updated as well. This is more relevant for Config Manager because we have the same there, but it actually is in here as well. So if you expand and go to the app pool, you will see the WSUS app pool. You go advanced settings on that, and this is where you can actually increase, if needed, the number of memory, the amount of memory that is being used by that app pool. Rare scenarios, I had to go up to both 4 and 8 gigs of this, but you get the idea. So what else? Well, there is backup, which I see so many customers forgetting to do. But the deal is you want to be able to restore your WSUS server quickly if something goes wrong with it. Of course, you can do a VM snapshot, but sometimes it's quicker to just restore the database if something happened to the database. So how do you do a backup in SQL Express, which doesn't really have an agent running like the full SQL server does? So how do you do a backup? Any ideas? It's a scripting language. Snow really likes it. PowerShell, yes. So you open up a PowerShell prompt. You find a folder into which you have a script that runs the backup. And this is, of course, downloaded. I borrowed this from a SQL forum a few months ago. So I will run the script. I will specify the server. And of course, since this is an Express edition, I also need to install the, whoops, and type it correctly. I need to specify the instance. And SQL Express is a fun installation because even if you say default instance, it really creates an instance anyway. So you need to specify that instance. And I need to specify a folder where I want my backup. And I need to specify a number of days to store the backups. Typically a week or 5 or 6, 7 days, whatever you like to store it. And then you run the backup. And of course, you can schedule this. Go into schedule task, have it to run this backup once a day. And then you have a backup of the entire WSUS configuration. Because when you install WSUS, you will get the database here like this. Another type of configuration that you can do, of course, in SQL is also go to the files of the database. And you may want to cap the size of the log file. I mean, the default is 2 terabytes. And if you never ever do a backup, well, the log file may increase to a size you don't like. So I like to cap it to, say, 10 gigs. Because it shouldn't grow to that amount ever, as long as you guys do regular backups. SQL works that way. So this is something I recommend that you do. So that's the initial part. Then we have the configuration. And of course, you open up the WSUS console. I have created a bunch of target groups here. And these I consider to be an absolute bare minimum. Most of you will have more, but this is like a bare minimum. And this goes into the different waves that Terry talked about, that you guys, of course, need to continue with the plans that most of you already are doing, and that is assigning a bunch of servers, a bunch of clients, to which you always deploy updates, including the update and the update roll-ups, of course. Verify that it works, and when you've figured out that they worked, you take the same updates and you deploy them to the production target groups. So how do you make this work? Well, creating groups here is not that difficult. But of course, you need to configure the updates as well. So you have the products and classifications. This is where you select the products. This is where you select, for example, these update and update rollups that Thierry talked about. But also, you need to configure any languages that you might have as well if you want to download them. Now, this can be done in PowerShell as well. So if I open up another script that I have, not in that folder, but in this folder. This is, for example, where you can find out the various products that are available in WSUS. And you need to have an elevated command prompt, PowerShell prompt. That's a beautiful live demo. What can possibly go wrong with that? So here you get all the products that are available for selection. You can do the same for classifications, and you get them listed. And in a script, you can take these, you can get them, get the value, and then set them. So you can actually set the entire configuration in PowerShell as well through the WSUS server, which is pretty cool. So back to my target groups. How do I get them into play? I use group policies. So many of you have seen this option. So you go to your domain controller. So I will remote into my domain controller. Here I have 2 OUs, which I'm using for my pilots. I have a Service Pilot OU and a Workstations Pilot OU. To that OU, I've added at least one of the machines I want to test, and into the workstations, I have a few clients that I want to test as a pilot. And then I go in and I create a policy for this. So I will have one policy that will put these clients into the target OU for servers. I have another policy for my workstations that will do the same thing, but instead put these machines into that group. And then in WSUS, they will simply be added here, and I can also create views to see the updates that I have approved for these types of machines. And once I verify that they work, I'll simply take the same updates and approve them for my production target groups or computer groups, whatever you like to call them. So the process is quite easy. Test them first, apply them, then approve them to the other groups in the environment. So a lot of customers, they try this, but they never ever get any machines into this group. So what are they missing? There is another configuration you need to do as well. Policies, it's not enough. In options, there is a computers node, and you need to change the default value to say, hey, I want to use group policy for this. Otherwise, it won't take effect, and the machines won't end up in your target groups. And I see a lot of people actually run into that issue. All right. Here I have some Windows 10 updates. For those of you that want to play around and test with Windows 10 currently, you know that those updates are not yet in WSUS. So how come I have them here and they're still not in WSUS? I imported them. Yes, from where? PowerShell. That's a good attempt, but no PowerShell. It's easier than that. It's in Internet Explorer. The update catalog site or catalog update Microsoft.com site, here you can actually search for Windows 10 technical preview. If I can spell preview. Not doing very well here. And then I get the updates that are available. And of course, I can add a few of them into a basket, and I can download them. And this doesn't help me much. So I will clear this basket. And I'm going to do the same operation from within WSUS instead. Because in the console, there is an import updates option. And when I do that, I will go to the same site, but in the link above, actually do some magic to this. So I can still search for updates, Windows 10 technical preview. I can still add them to my basket. So I will, for example, do this one for build 74, that was released Monday, an update that fixes issues with the start menu in Windows 10. And I can add that to my basket. But now when I do that, I have a checkbox here. Import directly into WSUS, and it will do that. So for those of you testing and playing around in the lab environment, yes, it's possible to add them here as well to your normal implementation, and then you can create a view with them, etc., to deploy them. So that's kind of nice as well. So that was the standalone WSUS. What about Config Manager? Well, it's not that more difficult, but in Config Manager, you have many more options for updates. The initial setup is about the same. You still need a SQL Server, but since you have Config Manager, you already have a SQL Server locally on your single primary site. Nobody's running a CAS, right? Greg is, but you're excused because you are more than 100,000 people until next week when Service Pack 2 is released, and you can scale up to 150. So you need help with the migration to your new single primary site? This is Greg Ramsey with Dell. He manages software updates and a bunch of other stuff in their environment, or tell other people to do it. They have a big site, though. So the setup is the same. You still use SQL. You still do the memory cap of the database, of course, but since you're a config manager, you don't do 2 gigs anymore. The minimum supported is 8, and that's for a small site. You probably will have more if you're a larger site, but you can't go below that and still be supported by Microsoft. You still do the same thing for the databases. For the SUSDB, you will go into the files, you will cap the log files, you will do that configuration, and backups are way more easy. Never ever use the built-in maintenance task in Config Manager for backups. Never. That was for 2007. For 2012, we do SQL. Why? It's super fast, it can compress the backup, and it doesn't stop the Config Manager site while it's running the backup. I was working with a customer that had a lot of distributed sites where they were trying to distribute images, and they have a backup running every night. So the image was almost distributed when the backup kicked in, stopped all services, so they have to start the image again. And it never finished because the next day the backup kicked in. So you should use SQL Backup instead. It's a super fast and super efficient way and supported way to deal with backups for Config Manager. So I have a backup plan here. It's quite simple backup plan. If it's open. Have 3 different jobs in it. One job that will actually create and clean up the history after 2 weeks, the information about the backups. Then I have the backup configuration itself. And as you can see, I have specified a bunch of databases, but especially the SAS database. So it's being backed up. I'm backing them up to a single folder. And then I create a subfolder for each database underneath it. So that means if I go to that folder, I will have a subfolder for each database. So here is my various double SAS databases that I have. And then, of course, I have also a cleanup job to delete them after a while. So that's the maintenance job for the backup. Now, what about the configuration? Well, in Config Manager, as you probably know, SUP is a role that you add as a normal site role. So you will go to the admin node, you will go to your sites, you will right-click, you will say Add System Roles, you click through the wizard, and you select the role. And once you have done that, you end up with the configuration available on the site in which you can configure the various classifications and languages, etc. In Config Manager 2012, Microsoft added in an option to automatically download and deploy updates, which was a very frequent request from people that thought WSUS were awesome, but CMO7 and software updates weren't so awesome, because there was a lot of manual work involved in doing that. But now, with the use of these automatic deployment rules, you can achieve the exact same experience. But when you do that, you specify what updates to synchronize through that process. And if they are not enabled here, you won't get them, even if you define them in that automatic process. So make sure that when you configure the subcomponent, enable all the classifications that you want to be able to use, all the products that you want to be able to use, all the languages you want to be able to use. You will probably configure supersedence options as well. I usually go for this one here, but it's, of course, you can change that if you don't like it. But the deal is you have to have them available so that you can select them when creating these automatic deployment rules. So that's the initial part. The other part is, of course, to create a bunch of software update groups in software updates. And when you do that, the best thing is, of course, to start to play around with searches. That's how you group things in Config Manager. So I have a bunch of software update groups here, but I also have searches that corresponds to those software updates, so I can easily find and approve updates. Here I have that automatic deployment rule I talked about. So I'm going to create a new one. Create automatic deployment rule. Server pilots, whatever I like to call it. Servers pilot. Can create to select a template or select a collection to deploy them to. And this is where Config Manager comes into play. You have many more options to deal with grouping on machines that is currently possible in the local version of WSUS. From what I read on the blog that was published yesterday, that feature is going to be added into that business version, but I don't have any more details than that. But it's a good blog post to read that was published yesterday. So I will select that pilot group or pilot collection. Select the level of errors I would like to see. Select some criteria for my updates, for example, what product I want to simp updates for. In this case, I may want to do servers. If you do older stuff still, like Windows 7, 2008, R2, you may be interested in also adding title as a criteria. Why? And Kent is not allowed to answer. Excluding updates. For example, if you guys are not deploying a lot of embedded systems, there is no point of syncing them. If you're not deploying a lot of Itanium servers, don't sync those updates. They're not needed. You're just creating a large packages that you're never going to use ever. So that's something you can add as well as a condition. A nice thing here is you can also do a preview, and then you will see a list of all the updates that the current filter would specify. When to run the rule? On a schedule or after a software update sync? Well, I typically like to run it on a schedule. So when? Well, at the very least, once a month. And how about this? Every second Tuesday, around 11 p.m. at night. Why don't I select every second Wednesday? Exactly. Second Wednesday doesn't have to be after second Tuesday. And you want Microsoft to actually have released the updates before you try to download them, install them, or deploy them. So I recommend to actually do it late Tuesday, but hopefully around 11 p.m. they should be deployed, if you do your job right, which you do. So it's rare that I don't go out on a Tuesday. Can any of you remember when I didn't? Because I cannot. Sorry? Last month? Some updates came on Wednesday. I didn't know that, but all right, good to know. For the last, I don't know when you started to do patch updates. Was it like in 2003, Tuesday updates?
It's been a long, long time.
Yeah.
But to be fair, we don't only release on Patch Tuesday. We release primarily on Patch
Yes.
Tuesday, but we release at other times also. Sometimes on Wednesday.
Yeah. So this is a good starting point, but of course you may need to run these rules more frequently. And then you specify, all right, when install them. And I know Kent, he's a total chicken, so he normally don't deploy them directly. He actually create the disable deployment and then enable it manually. I normally go ahead and just install them and deploy them directly and restart. Again, this is for my pilots. The few servers and the few workstations I designate as pilots. Alert information, what to do with them, download, do not install, always get them. Select the deployment package, create a new one. You can pick one server updates. Never ever add more than 1,000 updates into a group, or also I don't recommend to add that in general to a package, even though you can have more in a package. Where to get them, the languages, and you're set. You can save this as a template, but now you have an automatic rule that will automatically every month get these updates, put them into a software update group, and deploy them, in this case, to my server pilots collection. So what that means that after a while, I will have a few update groups that I can simply go ahead and deploy to other environments as well, to other collections. So that leads me to collections. This is what I consider a bare minimum for Config Manager. So you can see I have 11 collections. I have my pilot collections, and I have at least one production collection. But I also have maintenance windows, which we currently do not have in WSUS. So here I have a maintenance windows that if I put servers into this one, in this collection, updates will be applied every Saturday between 7 and 11 p.m. And there is a reason for me having a 4-hour window. In my experience, if having less, you may risk not getting all those updates installed during that window. So don't cheat on time here, at least 4 hours. If you want to be really safe, you can actually have an extra collection that runs maybe once a month, where you have an 8-hour window, sort of a catch-up collection for all the updates, but at the very least, 4 of them. So I actually add my various servers into one of these 4 maintenance windows. And then to my production collection, you can see that in here as members, I have those maintenance windows. So servers are added into maintenance windows collections, Those collections are added into production, and it's to production I deploy my updates. But I also create a collection that is excluded, servers that should not be, for some odd reason, part of the patching plan. You may have those devices. You may have servers that really need to be taken care of manual, to really be dealt with on a manual base. And then I have a non-managed collection. In the non-managed collection, if I go properties, I have added the others, exclusions. And then I have a query that includes every server it finds. This way, I will find all servers in my environment that is not part of a maintenance plan, that is not excluded, that is not manual, meaning servers that I have missed. And if that number says 80, it's bad. 3, probably okay in a lab and test environment, but you want to make sure you hit them all. So that was the configuration side of it. Then we have the imaging part. And I still recommend using MDT Light Touch to create your reference images. The reason it's super fast, and what you can do in the sequence, this is a Windows 10 sequence, but I can also show, I can do a Windows 10 sequence. I've simply added in actions that will have the sequence, when it reaches that point, install all the updates. And always, always use a virtual machine. There is a sure way to upset me, and that is showing me a physical machine that is being used for reference images. Don't do that. Use a VM. These guys wanted to use Hyper-V, but a VM is fine. It has to be a VM. A small caveat in MDT, what you will realize, it doesn't install all the updates, even if you tell it to install all the updates, because it caches the setup of those. So you need to add a script that does a reset of the list. So I'll show you a link to that later. If you want to do updates in Config Manager and don't mind it taking about twice the time, you can still do this. You will have to add more to your sequence. So a typical build and capture in Config Manager will take about 5 hours for a Windows 7 image. So this is what you need to add. An entire section that will install these updates many, many times. Because a single run doesn't do it. You don't get all the updates. Because sometimes we install something that requires a reboot that then installs something else. And what you should do in between is reset the list. Exactly as I showed you in Light Touch, I showed you the script that did the reset. You do the same thing in Config Manager. You add an action that resets the base, and then when the next scan actually kicks in and run, it makes sure that all updates are installed. So as long as you have these lists, you can do a build and capture in Config Manager as well. But I still recommend doing it in Light Touch if you have the option. A final tweak to this, if you go to my blog and search for Like a Boss, there is an article on how to create reference images like a boss. I even bought a nice photo from iStock Photo and added to this, so check. But in here I have added guidance, step-by-step instructions from TechNet, virtual labs, videos on how to do this. I've added some tips on how you can create the image smaller. There is a built-in option now in both Windows 7, 2008, 2012, and Windows 8 as well, and Windows 10, that allow you to clean up the image before you do a capture of it, saving you at least a gig in space of that image. The downside is you can't uninstall the updates, but hey, you are building an image. If you didn't like one of the updates, disable it from WSUS, build the image again. You don't uninstall from a reference image. You build a new one. Another thing you can do, this is the link to the script I talked about that cleans all the updates, and it's written by one of the Microsoft consultants, Alexei Semibratov. He lives on the East Coast now. In the VM that you configure, make sure if you deploy Windows 7 to bump up the memory to 4 gigs for that VM. Otherwise, you will find that not all updates will be installed. I recommend adding 2 CPUs to that VM because that will cut the capture time in half instead of using a single CPU. Another thing you can do, you can change capture from using ImageX to DISM. This is now being fixed in MDT 2013 Update 1 that will be released in Q3 this year together with, well, Windows 10 timeframe-ish. So you don't have to worry about that. And if you don't have a solid-state drive, which you should, but you can convince your manager to get your memory, there is actually a cool little utility from Starwind you can download. It's a freeware. But what it does, it creates a RAM disk that Windows thinks is a hard drive. And then you put your virtual disk on that one. And when that disk is RAM, it turns out to get pretty good read and write performance from that volume. Just don't reboot the host, because that will sort of erase it. But this is pretty cool technology. So all in all, use Waves. Worry about the SQL configuration. Don't forget to configure the backup. So if everybody in the room, or anybody in the room didn't do that in their environment, go home and do that after this session. All right, so back to you, Terry, for some Q&A and wrap up.
Yes, thank you, Johan. Awesome. So quickly summarizing, let's let this thing switch over. There we go. So I wanted to quickly summarize what we discussed and then ask for Q&A, really. This is your time. So deploy security updates as soon as possible. Deploy hotfixes proactively when they can prevent really big problems. Validate, give us feedback, and deploy Windows updates and roll-ups and images and cumulative updates and images. And then use Johan's best practices for database size, memory size, for imaging, for configuring groups, for configuring schedules. I actually didn't have it on here, but I should have. The schedule is important, so getting the schedule right is important too. So we're done, but please, now is your time. So please give us questions and comments, and we'll take feedback. Thank you. Yes. If you don't mind, step up to your microphone so that as it's being streamed, others can hear it too.
Yell it out, we'll repeat it.
Regarding the, I think the gentleman over here spoke about the 30 software updates that came out after Patch Tuesday recently for Windows 8 in 2012. You said there was a big uproar over that. I was just confused. I saw it come through, and yeah, you guys have released updates outside the regular Patch Tuesday window, but what I'm saying is that going to be the norm now with these optional updates? They're going to be released later? Because I'm actually already doing everything you asked. I'm rolling out optional updates, testing them, all 5 things you asked I'm doing currently. So I saw those come through. I just added them to my software update group, and they went out. So should
awesome. Where can I pay you?
Yeah, well, I mean, we implemented patching. When I came on board in my company, we were like 190 updates out of date across the board. And so we did this. It's been a huge success. I get phone calls all the time. Thank you for updating my computer. It's been great. But,
wow. Awesome.
So I
did not pay him yet.
Yeah, well, I mean, seriously, what this guy's recommending has been awesome for us. So
this is great. Yeah. So the answer to the question is, right now, we need your feedback.
Yeah.
So right now, we are in the schedule where on Patch Tuesday plus a week is when we release optional updates that are slated for the next month.
Okay.
But that will change depending on your feedback. It may not be the right time, depending on your schedule, as Johan said, depending on when you're syncing and things like that. So we're open to doing this in different ways based on what is important and what works. In this case, it happened to be a bunch of them, and that's what caught the attention of the press. But we've been doing this for 2 years, as I said.
Right.
And we haven't always done it on that day of the month, but we've always done it for 2 years.
Well, if you've got the blog, maybe posting something there, hey, we're going to do a kind of non-standard big release, no big deal, just optional, that'd be good to know. Because I just saw it come through, and I was like, what the heck? I was actually training a guy on doing updates, and he was like, wow, what's this big bunch of updates? It's not Patch Tuesday.
Yep.
Yeah, so we were just confused, so that's good to know.
Yeah, definitely. So hook up with the blog. We'd love to have those dialogues with IT pros, and we don't have a good place to do that now. But yeah, thank you. And let's go to that side, if you don't mind.
Okay, yeah.
Johan, hi. Great session, thank you. You mentioned that you didn't recommend using the built-in maintenance task to back up SCCM.
Correct.
Right. So, but the thing that worries me, though, is that the SCCM maintenance task, there's some things, it backs up some site data that's not just the
It
database.
used to do that back in the days with CMOS 7, not anymore.
Oh, so
A
now it
SQL
just
backup
does
is
the
the
database.
only thing you need. You can actually restore a site server completely from having just the SQL backup.
Okay, and then second real quick question. I saw you had the scan step in task sequence,
Yes.
the task sequence, but I have never been able to get that to work. The trigger, and it's got 113 on the end.
You mean in the config manager sequence?
Yeah, in the config manager sequence. Is there some trick to making that work? Because it fails on me when I try and do
The
that.
main trick is to make sure you have CU4 installed and that you have the sequence already updated the agent to CU4 when it runs. There was some major issues with software updates prior to CU4 when launched through a sequence. When it reaches a certain number, it just...
Okay.
So
So make sure
CU4 it is.
CU4 for
Config Manager R2.
config manager R2 CU4 is installed.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So that's the trick.
Over here.
Hi, we're starting to do your recommendation, looking at hotfixes, start to looking at deploying them proactively. The hotfixes aren't in the catalog. How do we deploy it?
So, yes, you're right.
Are you
We-
looking to eventually start incorporating those into the
Yeah,
catalog?
so I mentioned a convenience rollup or cumulative rollup for Windows 7 and 2008 R2. That's where we have a lot of hotfixes that have not been published in the catalog. That will be the way to catch you up. And then, since for the last few years, we have been publishing them, but there's a whole bunch of missing ones. We'll catch you up that way.
So should we wait
Hang
until
on for
we
a
get
couple
to
of months.
those? Okay.
This summer, I can't promise a date, but sometime this summer, there'll be a convenience rollup. My team and others are working on that now.
But going forward, as we get those hotfixes,
So
that
now
are
they
gonna-
do go to the catalog.
They will in the
Yeah.
future go to the catalog. Okay, thank you.
Some over
Thank you.
there
Let's
as well?
go back there. Or
Recently, we've seen additional load on machines when they actually do the catalog scan. It's not supported to actually touch your WSS database when you're doing it through Config Manager, but all the WSS cleanup, get rid of the old expired superseded updates step. What do you guys advise for Config Manager admins who are seeing excessive load against this expanding Windows Update catalog?
All right, so basically it's a manual process that you have to do. Of course, you can configure it automatically, supersede those updates, but every once in a while, like every year, you will have to go in and you search for updates that are already expired and you simply delete them out of the system.
Directly in
And that
CM
will-
or over in WSS database?
You don't have the exact same option in WSS. You can still do server cleanup. There is an operation in that for that in WSS, but it's not as efficient as the one that you have in Config Manager, where you very easily search and exclude things.
If I understand correctly, though, even if I delete things from CM, it doesn't always delete all the remnants of the things that were never enabled or synced over to Config Manager. So all the things that were never disabled, even if I don't deploy them, my clients are still scanning them.
So there are additional cleanup scripts you can run for Config Manager, and I'm pretty sure that Kent actually posted one on his blog that can help with that.
You
I can
guys-
also make
you guys
a
recommend-
statement here. Sorry, I can also make a statement to that because we exactly have the same issue, and I would recommend cleaning it up a lot more than once a year because the standard document procedures using PowerShell, whatever Microsoft recommends, they do not work. And you start with what Johan was just saying with you bump up the application pool. So we've set it to unlimited. So we had like 23,000 updates that had to be cleaned up, and none of the standard procedures worked. So we ended up doing that via SQL directly. That was the only option. So do it like once a month or once a week, and then you don't run into these problems. So it actually cut down our memory usage by half during the scan process.
But there are scripts that can help you do the process. You can bump up the memory in the app pool to allow for...
Yeah,
at
but
least
the actual
temporary-
PowerShell scripts didn't work. So whatever we tried to do, it just didn't work. So we ended up doing that in SQL, and that was the only procedure that actually did work then.
All right.
Even though Microsoft
Thank you.
didn't want to give us the blessing, but
I
mean,
see
it
long
worked.
lines for questions, so thank you for that. So definitely take questions offline. We're over, but feel free to keep asking questions. We'll stick around. Can we go over there?
Yeah, I'm curious what the roadmap is for Server 2012 as it relates to hot fixes. We're seeing a large trend where the hot fixes are being released, but they're only being released for Server 2008 R2 and Server 2012 R2, and it seems like 2012 is not included.
That's not intentional. It must be case by case. Server 2012 is fully supported. It has a life cycle of 10 years from release. So we will keep doing hot fixes as needed on Server 2012.
Okay, and I have a follow-up comment, which is we're also seeing with respect to proactively deploying hot fixes that there's a handful of hot fixes that require the features to be installed before the hot fixes can actually be deployed. And I'm wondering if
require what to be installed?
So the cluster feature is the primary one that we're seeing a trend where you have to actually have that feature installed. So
yeah,
we're trying to include these hot fixes as part of our build, but we don't include cluster for every one of our builds. And so my comment is it would be nice to not have to have the features installed in order to proactively update the build.
Okay, it's good feedback. We should have a longer dialogue about that.
Okay, the recording is being stopped now, so if you have any more questions, come join us here on stage and we'll be happy to answer those. So
thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Get it. Thanks a lot, guys.